Well, good afternoon. For those of you in London, at least, my name is Michael Mainelli. I am one of the directors of Zien Group, and it is my delight to welcome you to our webinar today. We're here today with Bob Garratt, and we're going to be
Right.
discussing Stop the Rot. Now, Stop the Rot is a book that Bob wrote some time ago, 3 years ago, and it's a book I treasure. Bob's a dear old friend, or an old dear friend, I should probably say.
Dear old
And
friend.
there you go. And it's going to be great to have Bob talk through some of the issues that he saw both when he did this book, which is it's not typical for us to feature a book from that period as a book review. But Bob has done a tremendous amount of work over the years with, in fact, the city as well, and has some fairly good and slightly disturbing observations to make. We're here as well, obviously because of our many sponsors, and I know that a number of them have said we haven't been doing enough on governance, and I think it's great to pick on Bob because Bob has been in the field for ages and has got the perspective that I think governance truly requires. I'm going to bow out in a second and drive the slides, and Bob is going to present for about 20 minutes his thoughts, not just on the book, but where things have been going over the last few years, and whether he's optimistic or pessimistic about them, you can ask yourself. So do ask questions using the question facility here on GoToWebinar, and I will field them to Bob towards the end. But for now, Bob, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mike, and good afternoon. Yeah, this short paper I produced was for the All Parliamentary Party Group on corporate governance, which is in the Houses of Parliament. So it covers both the MPs and the peers who have an interest in the future of corporate governance. And I was asked, would I talk about the 21st Century Board and how it might vary, particularly in terms of its context, in terms of what's going on at the moment. When I was faced with this, I suddenly thought, well, this is the one chance in my life I have where I can actually talk with the legislators rather than the regulators or other people involved. So I focused my short talk on that, and it had a surprisingly positive response. So it felt as though, and this was 2 days before lockdown in the UK, the legislator, or some of the legislators at least, were interested in having a rethink about corporate governance, how far we've got. Could I have the first slide, please, Mike?
There you go.
Thanks. And part of the argument I had was that we've been focusing in the UK particularly on the role of directors. And in doing that, we've tended to let the other parts of the system, the owners, the regulators and legislators, off the hook. I argue that they also have rights and duties, but these are nowhere near as well developed as the rights and duties of directors. And that owners, regulators, legislators and directors are not considered at the moment as part of a system, let alone part of a national learning system of how we develop our organizations for the future. So I'm not just talking about listed companies here. I'm talking about all companies, all registered companies. I'm talking about state-owned enterprises. I'm talking about government agencies, but I'm also talking about not-for-profits, for charities, etc., etc. Remembering that 90% of our registered companies have never been anywhere near listing of any sort whatsoever. So faced with a group of legislators, I then was saying to them, look, you passed a fantastic Companies Act in 2006. But how many of you know the core parts of that in relation to corporate governance? And this is the second time I've been able to talk with them. And to my surprise, virtually nobody present in groups of roughly 80 last occasion, 90 on the previous occasion, had any idea what I was talking about, i.e. they had not been present in the House or the Houses of Parliament at the time this went through, and they simply didn't know the core. They had very firm opinions on a lot of this stuff, but they didn't actually have very many facts, rather. So I was taking them back to what I think are effectively the three key A4 pages which define corporate governance. But contextually, I was saying to them, look, I was working with Adrian Cadbury and people like that before 1992 and before the creation, in the public's mind at least, of the notion of corporate governance. And before 1992, we used to call it board effectiveness. And I think that's what it's about. And what I'm looking for right now is to re-energize the whole notion of what is an effective board. So may I have the next slide, please, Mike? And I was just reminding folk where the word governance comes from, because the actual act of governing around a boardroom table, and I am mainly a practitioner rather than an academic, and I sit on boards and work with boards, and I've worked in 40 countries around the world with them, is how do we handle this particular dilemma? How do we drive our business forward into a healthy future, whilst at the other hand keeping it under prudent control? And this balancing between is what a board is meant to do, what I call the director's dilemma. Coming from the ancient Greek Kubernetes, the person who steers a ship, so giving direction, and then with a second part of it, which is often missed out, which is a Greek word, but now seen in modern terms, in modern English, as cybernetics. So on the one hand, how do we go forward, Kubernetes, and how do we keep under prudent control cybernetics, the systems by which we do that? And most boards I work with don't know about either of those words, don't really understand the director's dilemma, although intellectually they sort of are aware it's there and they must do something about it, but have little idea of how you then take it forward. May I have the next slide, please? And so what I was saying to the legislators was I was suggesting there's possibly a dereliction of their duty in three areas. One, the running sore of their failure to resolve in 130 years the issues of unlimited liability and the issue of the controlling mind, i.e. the responsibilities of a board in those areas, the limits or the contextual elements of the total oversight of the board, and then followed up by a failure to enforce the board's duty to deliver their purpose, and also the failure to enforce the 7 duties of the director. May I have the next slide, please? And I was not surprised to find that they didn't know of the Salamon's judgment back in 1890. This was when we had more and more very fast-growing, very large companies, and more diversity of shareholding, with people holding large shareholdings, individuals and families holding large shareholdings, wanting to try and limit their liability. And to cut a long story short, it ended up with a Salamon's inquiry in 1890, and Justice Salomon saying in the end that yes, a future corporation was an entity in itself. It had a separate legal personality. It had the ability to make contracts, to sue and be sued. And interestingly, the shareholders were no longer seen as having controlling ownership of their organization. The company owned its assets. These are separate from the shareholders. The shareholders only have the rights to dividend streams and the residual assets if things go wrong. And they have the right to vote at AGMs and EGMs, and especially the right to vote, obviously, for directors. But they don't own the company. And the directors, often part-time and untrained, are often charged with directing their company through having unlimited liability. I have the next slide as well, please, Mike. But this was never fully resolved, and William Gladstone, Prime Minister at the time, was beside himself. And if you read the history of the time, he was more and more angry that we still haven't been able to resolve exactly how we get to a point where both the liabilities of directors and boards and this issue of who is the controlling mind or minds of a board have been resolved. So we get to a point where in March this year, just over a month ago, we have the acquittal to public disquiet, at least, of the final Barclays director on fraud charges. And Mr. Justice Jay says in his judgment, the bank could not be held accountable for the actions of its chief executive, but neither could the chief executive be held accountable for the actions of Barclays. So this is a ridiculous situation that does need resolving and has needed resolution, as I say, for about 130 years. So my first challenge to the legislators present was, can we please begin to sort this out so we know exactly not only what a board is meant to do, but its responsibilities and its liabilities within that. And that is still a running sore in our legislation, which is a bit weird in some ways, because as I go around the world, I find Britain is praised so highly for the quality of its corporate governance. But when you get into that, people are normally talking about the codification of some of the law and the codification of the codes, but increasingly we're seeing codes that stray well away from any notion of assessing the effectiveness of boards and directors, and more into areas of interest to politicians and others who are trying to, I argue, over-engineer what should be a very simple code. May I have the next slide? One of the issues is we therefore have little enforcement. And I was challenging the legislators by saying, look, you're the people who create the codes in the first place, but you don't seem to have any rigorous system for following through and for implementing what comes out of your legislation itself. And I was specifically talking about sections 172 and 171 and 172 of the Companies Act, which deals with these very issues. That is where I was surprised to find that it's a fairly large audience. Nobody in the audience was able to give more than 3 duties of a director. And certainly no one in that audience was able to list the elements of the purpose of a board of directors. So we're facing a tricky situation where, because people don't know and because they're therefore not implementing, we're not getting enough follow through in terms of compliance with the Act through the court system. And therefore we end up with things like Justice Jay's rather worrying, rather alarming judgment. May I have the next slide, please, Mike? So just a reminder of Section 171 of the Companies Act, the first part, and a reminder that really from last year, it's now mandatory for companies to provide an annual report outlining the consequences of their decisions on, and then we've got a list here, the likely consequences of any decision in the long term, the interests of the company's employees, the need to foster the company's business relationships with suppliers, customers, and others, the impact of the company's operations on the community and the environment, the desirability of the company maintaining a reputation for higher standards of business conduct, and its need to act fairly as between members of the company. And what I was arguing to them was, because some of them had already asked questions in this area, there's no need for new legislation, and there's no need to get overexcited about sustainability, the environment, employees, the relationships with customers, and the relationship with the community, because the actual legislation for that has existed since 2006. But nobody seems to be taking responsibility for making sure this is rolled out in any systematic and rigorous way. To my surprise, I got a little round of applause at that point. And I'm happy to say that many of the people in the room were new, the incoming new intake from the December 2019 election. So there may be some energy to begin to do something in this area. But if you look at it, particularly elements B, C, and D there, we have ideas of integrated reporting. We have the basis for triple bottom line reporting. We have the whole notion of the purpose of a company is the purpose of a board in a company is to ensure a healthy future. And that healthy future is done in relation to the environment, the community, the employees, and the other members of the supply chain. And that, I think, was a bit of a shock to some of the people in the room, because they thought they were going to come into having to create a lot of legislation, create new laws. But the implementation of the present law might be exactly what they need to do. It's also worth noting in section 172 that there is no mention of shareholders per se. It doesn't. They don't. They're treated as members of the company, but there's nothing about the supremacy of shareholders. And I argue very strongly, shareholders are not supreme. And one of the reasons we got ourselves into a mess, generally, but specifically in relation to corporate governance, is we've over-concentrated on shareholders without being clear as to what we mean by modern-day ownership. So on the one hand, taking an extreme example for them, I was saying we have trading in under nanoseconds now. What does ownership mean then? And on the other hand, we have growing notions built into the legislation and into the governance codes of stakeholders. And what do they mean? And how can we span, or can we span, the bridge between nanosecond trading and long-term stakeholders? And that was part of the quite interesting set of questions we got involved in. May I have the next question, please, Mike? Next slide, please, Mike. So I then asked, did they know the 7 duties of a director? And as I say, nobody was able to get more than 3, and most of them, frankly, kept very quiet and shifted their eyes and looked rather embarrassed about the whole thing. So just a reminder that to act within the board's constitution, that is the way it's set up, which is normally badly under the Memorandum and Articles of Association. But then much more importantly, in terms of how we look at board effectiveness, how do we promote the success of this company? What does that mean? And how do we measure that? How do we exercise independent judgment? A notoriously tricky area, but one that is learnable and deliverable. And then absolutely fundamental, how do we exercise around this boardroom table reasonable care, skill, and judgment in the decisions we take? And then following on from that, how do we avoid the conflicts of interest that are always around? How do we ensure we don't accept benefits from third parties? And how do we declare interest in any proposed transaction that the board is discussing? And that, I thought, was very interesting, because I was getting feedback saying, you know, we don't have any induction in any of these areas. As legislators, we do not have induction in any of these areas. Frankly, we don't know much about this. And we assume that people on boards must know what they're doing. They must exercise, in your terms, reasonable care, skill, and judgment. They must exercise independent judgment. They must declare conflicts of interest, etc. And what you're telling us is most directors don't really know this stuff either, to which I had to agree. May I have the next slide, please? Have you got any more slides? Yeah. And so afterwards, I was able just to talk a little bit offline about what we might do about this. And as I say, on the one hand, I'm looking for a way of integrating corporate governance, so it becomes a learning system of directors, owners, legislators, and regulators learning from each other. And I think to do that at the legislative end, we need to set up not the proposed ARGA reporting authority, but we need to set up a national corporate governance reporting authority, because ARGA is still essentially being driven by accountants. And my line is, what the hell do accountants know about corporate governance? To which my answer is not a lot. But they have controlled it for a long time. Corporate governance has been a subcommittee of the Financial Reporting Council, not even a major committee of the Financial Reporting Council. And we have been driven too long by the accountancy bodies. We now need to actually create our own body. And that needs to be supported by a parliamentary select committee in that area, which created some interest, by the way, from the legislators. And I would argue personally, a standing commission on corporate governance to ensure public oversight of the whole as a system develops. And our organizations are too important social bonds to be left as knowingly ineffective. And that's where we ended that chat. Mike, do you wish to take over now and drive us a little bit? So yeah,
Yes,
that's
if
the
I
little
might.
national system. Yeah.
So, Bob, in short, you're really maintaining that there's no need for legislation. It's very
Yeah.
much about organization and enforcement,
Yeah.
and really communicating very clearly these seven duties and being a parent. Is there perhaps a need to rescind some legislation? So, for example, you point out, at least in the United Kingdom, 10 choices of legal entities, companies limited by share capital,
Yeah.
PLCs, limited by guaranteed, partnerships,
Yeah.
LLPs,
Yeah.
mutuals and cooperatives, employee ownerships, private equity ownerships,
Yeah.
public sector mutuals, social
Mm, mm.
enterprises. So, should are these all required? Do they genuinely serve good purposes? I mean, they all came with good intention, but could we
They all
cut back
came,
on some of that?
yeah, yeah. Personally, I think yes, and I also argue, and I've written recently quite strongly on the fact that I think we could most probably now drop about 90% of our corporate governance codes
Mm,
because they're getting out of hand. And on the one hand, yes, we don't need so many legal entities. But on the other hand, we're getting into codes, particularly in the financial sector and especially in the banking sector, which are getting wildly out of control. I
mm,
mean, you get occasionally now directors sitting around a table who are not quite sure when they can talk. Are they properly accredited or not? Are they an executive director or not? Remembering that executive and non-executive directors do not exist legally at all.
mm.
They don't appear in the law, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, I think we need a damn good sort of rodding through, clearing out of this area. And I suspect a lot of it will come through this notion of being very clear on the limitation of liability and very clear on the controlling mind issue, and therefore being very clear on the personal liabilities and the responsibilities of anybody who becomes a director of any of our organizations.
Now, I've heard you in the past, and you make a very cogent point that bringing in a lot of Americanisms like CEO
Mm,
confuses the situation because within the United Kingdom,
mm,
the most appropriate term and the legal term is managing director.
mm.
That's correct. But where do you stand, for example, on a lot of this terminology, in the sense that when we're looking at the controlling mind aspect, again, if we just got too many terms in there, we need to clear those away.
Um, well, first of all, a chief executive can be a totally legitimate position in an
Yeah, sure,
organization, but
exactly.
a chief executive is not a member of a board. When they become a member of a board, they become a managing director. And we've got terribly confused over the years. And this doesn't help when legislators and regulators kick around these terms as though they were interchangeable. Uh,
Correct.
that they're not. Um, but unfortunately, in many cases, people just use them anyway. Um, sorry, the other part of your question was the
No, it's just that the plethora of terms
yeah,
is
yeah,
also
yeah, yeah.
confusing. The plethora of
It is. No,
companies,
I
corporate
totally agree.
organizations.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Now we've got a few questions here. I'll pick up one if I might. This is from Cameron McNeil. Very good point he makes, which is UK company law transposes to a large extent EU directives. Where does that leave the UK now?
Uh, I'll have to ask Boris. I do not know, but I hope in many ways we actually carefully revert back to the UK law, particularly the law of England and Wales, which was a lot clearer and a lot more pragmatic. Because we've always had this tension since joining the EU and subscribing more and more to EU legislation between our common law system and the really Code Napoleon system of EU law. And they sit in very uncomfortable contradiction on many occasions. And people have found it, and I've spoken to some of the writers of the law, have found it very difficult to try and bridge the gaps. They are not easily compatible.
Cameron goes on a little bit as well. He talks about the identification doctrine does pose problems, but now we have CCOs in the Bribery Act and Criminal Finances Act and the Irish Law Reform Commissions, all recommending radical reform. What would you comment on that?
Well, I suppose in part I'd say right up to date, if I go back to Justice Jay's comments I just made on the Barclays case, that we've got ourselves into ever decreasing circles. I'm not quite sure where that ends up. It wouldn't be very comfortable. But I don't want to have a massive national commission of inquiry, because I think we have the necessary laws already in place. What I think we need to do is to have politicians pushing strongly their agencies, not necessarily just the Serious Fraud Office. There are other agencies, including the liquidators and all the rest of it, but pushing them to take forward sufficient cases to go through the High Court, to go through the Appeal Court, and if necessary, to end up in the Supreme Court. So we have definitive judgments in those three areas that I was talking about earlier, but particularly in the area of the limitation of liability and the whole issue of this controlling mind part.
Paul Barnett asks, is there support for the idea of a parliamentary select committee on this?
Simple answer is I don't know. I'm only just starting asking questions in the area. All I can say is I've had some very positive responses from a few people, and it certainly looks as though those folk in the All Party Parliamentary Group for Corporate Governance are interested in trying to take this a bit further. How much further it will go, I don't know. But if I can find some politicians, particularly MPs, who are really interested in pushing this through in the post-COVID era, I think we might get some quite rapid movement.
And where do you stand, another one here, on the senior managers regime? A lot of this stuff is almost sort of an end run to try and grab and ensure that there is individual responsibility, while at the same time trying to respect this body corporate. So is the individual actually committing a crime, or is the company committing a crime, and how do we square that one?
Well, this really exists in the financial area only, because if we go outside that, we don't get a senior managers regime. So we're talking about less than 10% of the corporate whole in the UK. And personally, again, I think that it's the wrong way to go if we can ensure that we get the liability issues clear at the boardroom level, because then the way in which we ensure prudent control as part of that definition of corporate governance is through the board. But it means that the board must exercise its superiority and not allow the senior managers, however defined, to be driving the show, with the board often just nodding assent.
I think we got time for me to maybe slip in three more questions. The first one's from Andy Agathangalu, who runs the Transparency Task Force. Are the objectives to create commercial success for an organization fundamentally conflicted with the objectives to govern it prudently? Should organizations have a board focused on the commercial operation of the organization and a separate one to keep it on the straight and narrow?
No, that's why I argue very strongly that Section 172 of the Companies Act should be much more rigorously followed through, so we integrate the whole if necessary, using triple bottom line reporting or integrated reporting, so that both the operational aspect and the directorial aspect of pushing ahead to ensure a healthy future are one and the same.
And Peter Aylwin follows up with, in a post-Brexit world, how do you feel corporate governance measures should be exercised both in the UK and the EU?
Find that one difficult to answer because I have become increasingly estranged from the EU. The work I've been doing, certainly in the last 10 years, has mainly been in common law countries. So particularly in the 54 countries of the Commonwealth and those who are influenced by it. I, for example, I spent 30 years inside China. I was there towards the end of the Cultural Revolution, and I helped set up the first MBA programs for the top level members of the Communist Party in the early 80s, and was then operating both in China, but particularly operating out of Hong Kong for a period of about 15 years. And I was able to watch very carefully the way in which the Chinese were beginning to develop their own notions of corporate governance, particularly swayed by the Cadbury Commission, and the way in which they were very taken, being a very pragmatic people themselves, with the pragmatism of UK common law. So a lot of my experience over nearly 20 years now has been watching either Commonwealth countries or Commonwealth or countries influenced by the development of common law, rather than, as I said earlier, going back to the more Napoleonic notions of European law. So I find it hard to give a definitive answer to that one.
Okay. And a final kind of question, because we're running out of time, and there are a number here. We will be able to get back to people via email. But Bob, you had a good swipe at accountants there, that for far too long governance has been left in the domain of accountancy, that is, if it's a subcommittee, I think you said, effectively to financial audit. And Paul Bennett is asking, Paul Bennett was asking, Barnett, I keep saying that, sorry, Paul. Paul Barnett was asking, should we have a body for governance audits in the way we have financial audits?
Yes. Full stop.
Because
if you remember, I mean, the Cadbury Committee, and certainly the Cadbury Report of 1992, had an amazing effect on people, just bringing the term corporate governance to life. And I worked with Adrian Cadbury around that time as well, but on boards and in companies rather than on the writing of the report itself. But it was very interesting to note that within 2 years of the publication of Cadbury, there are about 400 versions of it appeared all around the world, in many countries and in many corporations. And that really allowed the notion to take root that corporate governance was about accounting and about financial services, which is hardly surprising because the two people who funded the Cadbury report were the ICAEW, the accountants body, and the London's, or what was then the London International Stock Exchange. But sadly, that notion has never really been developed into a national notion of what corporate governance is about and how it affects charities. The Waits report last year began to talk about large private companies, but we must remember that well over 95% of our companies are much smaller than that. They still come under companies law, but they are not really catered for. And I'm not just knocking accountants here. Let me be clear, but they're not catered for in a way I think is going to be healthy for the future of the UK in the post-COVID world.
Bob, you've long had this idea about learning organizations, sort of a spin on Ashby's law of requisite variety
Yeah.
in a way that we need to have it. But I was wondering if you wouldn't mind, just in sort of 30 seconds to close, reminding people about the basic framework before they head off.
Okay. Well, if we go back one slide, please. Yeah. I mean, this is really Reg Revans and Ashby and all the rest of it. The notion that for any organism to survive, its rate of learning has to be equal to or greater than the rate of change in its environment, which I think today is horribly, horribly apt. But I have applied this very much to the work I do on board assessment and board development for about 25 years. And the simple model I use there is to say, look, if we're looking at board effectiveness, starting with the top right-hand corner of the proverbial quadrant, how do we develop policy? I.e., how do we look into the external world long term? And in the book, The Fish Rots from the Head, there's a whole chapter on just how do we do that. And then how do we take that notion of what we see as the changing external environment and to sometimes the changing internal environment as well, and turn that into strategic thinking. That is long term, but now much more with an internal focus on how do we broadly develop our very scarce resources to achieve our policy, our purpose. And notice I say strategic thinking, not strategic planning. I drop planning out of that. Planning for me is an operational, absolutely key operational activity, but it's not part of a board activity. It's the thinking of how we best deploy our scarce resource to achieve our purpose. That's the board's part. That then rolls over into how do we supervise management? So how do we keep our ops under prudent control, which is very internal and short term? My own psychological measures in this area show that over 90% of all the board members I've ever worked with are most comfortable in only thinking short term and internally. And they need often quite a bit of development to get out of their comfort zone to become proper, what I would call proper board members. And in the end, we then need to roll the whole of that up into short term but external, ensuring our proper accountabilities, which is why I've been batting on about the whole issue of the controlling mind and our responsibilities and our liabilities, etc. And that I argue that this is a continuing cycle. So you can draw arrows between all of those, balancing board performance. How do we go forward into a healthy future? With board conformance, how do we ensure that we keep the damn thing under control? That's the basic framework of the learning board.
Bob, that's an amazingly cogent structure and one that I have frequently used because you can keep it in your head. I think I end this this webinar, somewhat optimistic, actually. It's a big, tall hill ahead of us, but there's no real particular obstacles in our way, are there? We can achieve it if we want to.
Only ourselves.
Only ourselves. Well, folks, we've got a few more webinars coming up this week. Tomorrow, get your places. We have a very, very busy one. Henry Tillman's going to be talking about the first quarter results of the Belt Road Initiative. It's going to be fascinating. On Thursday, we have Ian Clegg talking about artificial intelligence in the retirement and insurance sector. So more webinars coming up. But if I could ask you all to join me, at least virtually, and say a warm round of applause to you, Bob. So thank you so much for presenting.
Well, thank you for inviting me. And if it's okay with you, on another occasion, I might talk a bit more about this whole ownership issue, but also report back on what's happening in the All Party Parliamentary Group.
Well, we would like that as well, and I'm sure we'll have you back soon to update us. Thanks again, Bob.
A pleasure.